His name is absent from most lists of history's greatest commanders. No statues of him rise in European capitals. No films bring his story to wide audiences. And yet, by nearly every measurable standard of military success, distance traveled, enemies defeated, and empires broken, Subutai of the Mongols surpasses them all. He was not born a prince, not the son of nobility, not the heir to any throne or title. He was the son of a blacksmith, raised on the wind-beaten grasslands of Central Asia, where survival itself was a kind of warfare. Over the span of 6 decades, he helped construct the largest contiguous empire the world has ever known, stretching from the Pacific shores of China to the plains of Hungary. He never lost a major battle. He fought across terrain no other general would dare attempt. And when he finally set aside his sword, the armies he had forged had changed the course of history across 3 continents. This is his story. Long before empires, before cities, before the great chronicles that would one day record their names, there was the steppe. It stretched for thousands of miles in every direction. A vast ocean of grass, wind, and skies so immense that travelers described it as walking within the horizon itself. No walls divided it. No rivers marked clear borders between one people and the next. The Mongolian plateau was a land that seemed to resist permanence, as though the earth itself refused to hold human ambition in one place for long. The people who lived here did not build monuments. They moved. Their entire way of life was built on motion. Felt tents known as zhuz that could be raised and taken down in less than an hour. Herds of horses and sheep that represented both wealth and survival. Clan networks that were as strong as iron and as unstable as fire. On the steppe, loyalty was everything. Betrayal meant death. And strength, real, proven, undeniable strength, was the only currency that earned respect. The Mongols of the 12th century were not united. That is perhaps the most important truth to understand about the world Subutai was born into. The plateau was divided into dozens of rival tribes. The Merkits, the Naimans, the Tatars, the Karites, and many others. They raided one another's camps. They stole each other's horses and women. They took each other's children as slaves. The cycle of revenge and counter-revenge had been turning for generations, and there was no authority powerful enough to end it. Blood feuds were not just personal. They were part of the system. A man whose father had been killed by a Tatar was expected to carry that hatred forward, to pass it to his sons, to let it shape his alliances and enemies for the rest of his life. The steppe ran on memory. It ran on debt. Every act of violence created an obligation, and every obligation set the stage for the next conflict. Into this world, sometime around 1175, though the exact date remains uncertain and likely always will, a boy named Subutai was born to a man named Jakagudai, a blacksmith of the Uriankai clan. The Uriankai were considered forest people, a group on the edges of the central Mongol tribal world. They were not warriors of great renown. They were craftsmen and hunters, people who lived close to the land. Subutai's father worked iron. He shaped metal into tools and weapons, learning from an early age how raw materials, when properly handled, could become instruments of immense power. Whether this influenced Subutai's later thinking, his belief that armies, like metal, could be forged into something stronger and sharper than their origins suggested, is impossible to know with certainty. History rarely provides such neat connections, but the image is worth holding. A boy who grew up watching his father transform one thing into another, understanding that transformation demands heat, pressure, and patience. What we do know from the primary sources, especially the secret history of the Mongols, that strange and invaluable record compiled shortly after Genghis Khan's death, is that Subutai entered the orbit of the great conqueror at a very young age. Some accounts suggest he was still barely in his teens. His older brother, Jelm, had already entered the service of Temujin, the young chieftain who was slowly and painfully gathering power across the steppe, and Subutai followed soon after. The secret history records Subutai pledging himself to Temujin with vivid and striking imagery. He compared himself to a rat that would gather food for his master, or a dark crow that would collect whatever scraps remained. He offered his body as a shield, his loyalty as absolute. On the steppe, Such words were not empty poetry. They carried the force of binding contracts. To speak them and then break them was not merely dishonorable, it was fatal in every sense. A man who betrayed his oath to a powerful leader had no refuge left anywhere. Subutai would never break that oath. Not once. Not across 60 years of service that would stretch over 3 continents. Temujin's rise to power remains one of the most extraordinary stories in human history, and it is impossible to understand Subutai without first understanding the man who shaped his path. Temujin had been born into a position of relative privilege. His father, Yesige, was a minor chieftain, but privilege on the steppe was always fragile and easily lost. When Temujin was around 9 years old, his father was poisoned by the Tartars, and soon after, the clan abandoned the family entirely. His mother was left to raise her children alone in one of the harshest environments on earth. They survived on wild onions, roots, and whatever small animals they could hunt or trap. At one point, Temujin killed his own half-brother during a dispute over food. These hardships did not destroy him. They refined him, sharpening his instincts and his resolve. By the time Subutai entered his service, Temujin had already endured kidnapping, slavery, and repeated betrayals. Yet he had also begun to show something unusual for the world he lived in, a willingness to reshape its rules when they no longer served his purpose. He freed slaves who proved loyal. He promoted men based on merit rather than lineage. He built alliances across tribal divisions that earlier generations would have considered impossible. He was creating something entirely new, even if he could not yet define it. The steppe operated on a strict logic of kinship. Loyalty was tied to blood, to tribe, to clan. You fought for your own people and no one else. Temujin began to recognize that this system, while effective in small-scale conflicts, ultimately limited greater ambition. A loose confederation of tribes, always at risk of fracturing along old loyalties, could never sustain the kind of large-scale campaigns he envisioned. He needed something stronger. He needed men who were loyal to him personally rather than to their clans. Men who could be trusted regardless of their origins. Men disciplined enough to follow orders in the chaos of battle, yet intelligent enough to act independently when required. Subutai would eventually become the purest expression of that vision. But before that could happen, there were years of difficult campaigning ahead. The early stages of Subutai's career survive only in fragments. The sources are incomplete, sometimes contradictory, and often shaped by the later glory attached to his name. Persian chroniclers writing decades after the events tended to merge Subutai into the broader narrative of Mongol conquest, rarely isolating his specific role in the early years. The secret history provides valuable detail, but remains selective, focusing primarily on Genghis Khan himself. What can be said with confidence is that Subutai spent his formative years in close proximity to Temujin and his expanding army, learning the structure and execution of Mongol warfare from within. And those methods were unlike anything seen elsewhere in the medieval world. The Mongol army was not a traditional standing force. It was, in essence, an entire society mobilized for war. Every man between roughly 15 and 60 years of age was expected to fight. Horses were managed collectively, and there were always far more horses than men, often 5 to 10 mounts per warrior. These animals were rotated continuously so that no single horse would be exhausted, allowing Mongol forces to maintain a level of speed and endurance unmatched by their enemies. Training began in early childhood. Mongol boys learned to ride almost as soon as they could stand, and archery was not a specialized skill but a fundamental necessity. The recurve composite bow they carried was a remarkable piece of engineering. Compact enough to be used effectively from horseback, yet powerful enough to pierce armor at significant distances, it required years of strength and conditioning to master. In the hands of a trained rider, it turned mobility into lethal precision, allowing Mongol warriors to strike from afar, withdraw, and strike again before their opponents could respond. A Mongol warrior could release arrows with deadly accuracy even at full gallop, firing forward, to the side, and even backward over the flank of his horse. The basic tactical unit was the Aben, a group of 10 men, which scaled upward into hundreds, thousands, and the famed tumens of 10,000. This decimal structure made command and communication extraordinarily efficient for its time. Orders flowed through a clearly defined hierarchy. There was no uncertainty over authority, no confusion about unit structure. In the chaos of a medieval battlefield, such clarity was nearly as valuable as the warriors themselves. Coordination was sustained through a refined system of signals. Flags, smoke, drums, and fire all carried meaning. A skilled commander could maneuver forces spread across miles of terrain without modern communication tools because every subordinate understood the signals and had practiced them until they became instinctive. The Mongols prepared for war with the same consistency that other societies devoted to farming, relentlessly, season after season, as a core part of their identity. Subutai absorbed this environment completely. He was not just another soldier shaped by it. From an early stage, those around him recognized something different, a capacity for strategic thought that went beyond the ordinary. He could hold multiple variables in his mind at once, anticipate developments before they occurred, and plan for outcomes that had not yet taken shape. These abilities would take time to fully reveal themselves, but the foundation was already present. His first major recorded independent command came in 1205, when Temujin sent him to pursue the Mokit tribes fleeing westward. Subutai tracked them across vast distances and ultimately defeated them, demonstrating the relentless pursuit strategy that would later define his campaigns. For Subutai, an enemy who fled was not spared, only postponed. Defeat was inevitable, merely delayed. This approach marked a shift from traditional steppe warfare, where a beaten enemy might be allowed to retreat and recover. Subutai did not believe in partial victories. When he moved to destroy an opposing force, he pursued until that destruction was complete. In 1206, on the banks of the Onan River, Temujin called a grand assembly, a Kurultai of the Mongol tribes. What took place there reshaped the political structure of the entire region east of the Caspian Sea. The gathered leaders proclaimed Temujin as Genghis Khan, a title often interpreted as universal ruler, though its exact meaning remains debated. With this declaration, he was no longer simply one chieftain among many. He became the supreme ruler of a unified Mongol nation. The world beyond the steppe had no real understanding of what was about to emerge. The newly formed empire quickly formalized principles that Temujin had already been applying in practice. A legal framework known as the Yasa established expectations of discipline, loyalty, and conduct. Military organization was standardized. The old clan-based forces were reorganized into decimal units, deliberately mixing warriors from different tribes. This weakened traditional loyalties and replaced them with allegiance to the unit and to the Khan. Identity was being reshaped. A man was no longer defined primarily by his lineage, but by his role within the larger system. Genghis Khan also established the Yam, a vast relay communication network built on mounted couriers positioned at regular intervals across the expanding empire. Through this system, messages could travel hundreds of miles in a matter of days. This was more than logistical efficiency. It transformed communication into a strategic advantage. The Khan could receive intelligence from distant frontiers and respond with remarkable speed. Information itself became a weapon, used with as much precision as any blade or arrow. For Subutai, the rise of the empire created the stage upon which his abilities could fully develop. As campaigns grew in scale and complexity, his strengths became increasingly valuable: careful planning, relentless execution, and the capacity to coordinate operations across multiple fronts simultaneously. His relationship with Genghis Khan stood apart from many of the other senior commanders. It was not purely formal, nor entirely personal, but something that combined both elements. It was built through shared hardship, tested trust, and years of observing one another in moments of pressure. Genghis Khan granted Subutai a level of operational freedom that few others received. He was allowed to conduct campaigns independently across vast distances, making decisions without constant direction from the center. This autonomy rested on absolute confidence, and Subutai consistently justified that trust. He did not fail in ways that would undermine it. The campaign against the Jin dynasty of northern China, beginning in earnest around 1211, became the first large-scale confrontation between Mongol forces and a settled, highly organized civilization. It revealed both the extraordinary effectiveness of Mongol warfare and its initial limitations. China was fundamentally different from the steppe. It was a land defined by fortifications. The Great Wall, along with its network of defensive structures, represented a strategy of defense unfamiliar to the Mongols. Here were fixed positions, fortified cities, and garrisons capable of enduring prolonged sieges. The fast-moving cavalry tactics that had overwhelmed opponents on open plains were less effective against stone walls and reinforced gates. Genghis Khan quickly recognized this challenge. Early incursions into Jin territory achieved devastating success in open engagements, where Mongol mobility and coordination could be fully utilized. But when facing fortified positions, new methods would be required. The Mongols would need to adapt to incorporate siege techniques, engineering knowledge, and new forms of warfare if they were to overcome these obstacles. The Jin cavalry was repeatedly outmaneuvered and shattered in open combat. Yet the cities themselves continued to stand. The Mongols could sweep past them, devastate the surrounding countryside, and then withdraw back to the steppe. What they could not yet do was hold territory. Holding territory meant controlling cities, and controlling cities required siege warfare, something that demanded both specialized equipment and technical expertise they initially lacked. So the Mongols adapted. This remains one of the most underestimated aspects of their military brilliance. It was not only what they could achieve with their native steppe skills, but how rapidly and thoroughly they could absorb the knowledge of others. Chinese engineers were captured or persuaded into service and set to work immediately. Under Mongol direction, they constructed siege engines, catapults, battering rams, and towering assault structures. Techniques for undermining walls, redirecting water supplies, and building the complex earthworks necessary for prolonged sieges were learned, refined, and mastered in a remarkably short time. Subutai played a significant role in this transformation. He grasped, perhaps more clearly than any other Mongol commander, that the empire's long-term success depended on its ability to capture cities. Cities were the centers of wealth, population, and administration. They were the foundation of settled civilizations. A conqueror who could only defeat armies in the open field would always remain limited. But a conqueror who could take cities could dominate entire civilizations. The campaigns against the Jin dragged on for years, marked by both staggering violence and moments of Mongol frustration. The Jin capital, Zhongju, known today as Beijing, did not fall until 1215. Its capture came only after a prolonged siege and the eventual betrayal of Jin commanders who opened the gates from within. When the city finally fell, the destruction was immense. Contemporary Persian and Chinese accounts describe fires burning for weeks and the remains of the dead lying in such numbers that they formed visible mounds long after the conquest had ended. The human cost of these campaigns is almost impossible to fully grasp from the distance of 8 centuries. Historians continue to debate the numbers, and medieval sources, often written by survivors or shaped by propaganda, cannot always be taken at face value. But there is no question that the destruction was real, widespread, and, in many cases, deliberate. Genghis Khan frequently used terror as a calculated instrument of war. Cities that surrendered were often spared. Those that resisted and were taken by force were subjected to annihilation. The message was clear and intentional. Resistance was not merely futile. It was catastrophic. Subutai did not create this policy, but he operated within it. The nature of his personal relationship to the violence he helped carry out remains a subject historians approach with caution. There is no evidence to suggest he was driven by cruelty or took pleasure in destruction. Rather, he appears as a man shaped by his time and culture, one who viewed violence as a practical tool of power and applied it with the same disciplined precision that defined his military thinking. That precision does not lessen the suffering. In some ways, it makes it even more unsettling. There is always a temptation, when examining campaigns of this scale, to remain distant, to focus on strategies, armies, and political consequences as if the human lives within those events were secondary. The conquest of the Khwarezmian Empire does not allow for such distance. Bukhara fell in February 1220. It was one of the great cities of the Islamic world, a center of learning, trade, and religious life that had attracted scholars, poets, and mathematicians for generations. The renowned scholar Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, had been born near Bukhara more than 2 centuries earlier. Its libraries contained manuscripts representing centuries of accumulated knowledge. Its mosques and madrasas were among the finest in Central Asia. The population, though difficult to estimate precisely, was substantial by medieval standards, and their lives revolved around commerce, scholarship, and faith rather than war. When the Mongol army arrived before its walls, the defenders chose to resist. Their numbers were insufficient to sustain a prolonged defense, and within days the outer city was breached. What followed was recorded by the Persian historian Giovanni, writing decades later under Mongol patronage. His position lends his account a complex tone, neither openly hostile nor entirely impartial. Giovanni describes Genghis Khan entering the main mosque and addressing the remaining inhabitants from a pulpit, declaring himself a form of divine punishment sent upon them. Whether those exact words were spoken or whether they reflect the historian's later interpretation remains uncertain. What is certain is what followed. The city was looted. Its granaries were emptied. Its wealth was seized, and large parts of it was set ablaze. The defenders who had retreated into the citadel were eventually destroyed. Samarkand, by contrast, chose to surrender rather than resist. Under Mongol practice, surrender often brought a degree of protection, and in this case, the city avoided total destruction. But survival came at a cost. Mongol forces occupied the streets, took control of homes, and requisitioned resources to sustain further campaigns. The population itself was reorganized, sorted according to need and utility, craftsmen, laborious, and others separated and absorbed into the expanding machinery of empire. The Mongols did not simply rely on speed and shock. Their campaigns were structured with an almost mathematical precision that made them uniquely effective against larger, more traditionally organized armies. Intelligence gathering was constant and systematic. Scouts rode far ahead of the main force, mapping terrain, identifying water sources, and tracking enemy movements. Captured locals were interrogated, sometimes brutally, for information about roads, defenses, and political divisions within target regions. This information was not gathered randomly. It was integrated into a broader operational picture that allowed Mongol commanders to make decisions with a clarity their enemies rarely possessed. Subutai excelled within this system. Even in these earlier campaigns, before his most famous victories, there are indications of a mind that understood warfare not just as combat, but as coordination across distance and time. Mongol armies often split into multiple columns separated by vast stretches of land, only to converge at precisely the right moment to overwhelm an enemy force. This required not only discipline but trust that each commander would arrive where and when he was supposed to. It also required a shared understanding of intent, something that Temujin had cultivated deliberately among his officers. Against the Khwarezmian Empire, this approach proved devastating. While the Shah attempted to defend his vast territory by dispersing his forces across Kiev, the Mongols did the opposite. They concentrated force at decisive, striking rapidly before moving on, leaving isolated garrisons unable to support one another. Cities that resisted were annihilated. Those that surrendered were often spared, though even then their populations were frequently broken apart, their economic and social structures dismantled to serve Mongol needs. Subutai's role during this campaign becomes clearer as they progressed westward. He, along with Jebe, was tasked with pursuing the afterthought of his major cities. What followed was not a simple chase, but across thousands of miles, through hostile terrain and unfamiliar lands. The Shah fled west, abandoning his army and attempting to regroup, but the Mongol pursuit never relented. Subutai and Jebe drove their forces across Persia, into the Caucasus, and beyond, adapting constantly to new environments and enemies. This pursuit demonstrated something critical about Mongol command philosophy. Subutai was not merely executing orders in a rigid sense. He was operating with a level of autonomy that allowed him to interpret and act on the broader strategic objective, the complete neutralization of the enemy. Along the way, Mongol forces engaged and defeated multiple regional powers, including coalitions that had formed specifically to stop their advance. Each engagement added to their understanding of foreign systems, terrain, and dynamics. One of the most remarkable aspects of this was its duration and scale. Operating far from the Mongol heartland, with no secure supply lines in the conventional sense, Subutai's forces sustained themselves through mobility and local resources. They moved quickly enough that no single region could fully prepare for their arrival. They avoided protracted sieges when possible, instead targeting field armies this allowed them to maintain momentum, which was arguably their greatest advantage. The psychological dimension of Mongol warfare continued to amplify their effectiveness. News of earlier destructions traveled faster than the armies themselves. By the time Subutai's forces approached new territories, many of their opponents were already demoralized. Some chose to fight and were crushed. Others attempted negotiation. A few tried to flee, as the Shah himself had done, only to discover that escape was often impossible against an enemy that could outmaneuver them across vast distances. Eventually, the Shah died in exile, his empire shattered beyond recovery. But Subutai's did not end there. Instead of returning immediately, he and G pushed further west, entering regions that had little prior contact with Mongol forces. This phase of the campaign was as much reconnaissance as conquest. They tested the capabilities of new enemies, including the kingdoms and steppe north of the Black Sea. The culmination of this came in the famous confrontation with a coalition of Rus princes and their allies. Though outnumbered, the Mongols employed tactics that would become hallmarks of their style: feigned retreats, ambushes, and the exploitation of enemy disunity. The opposing force, lacking unified command and coordination, was drawn into a trap. When the Mongols turned to fight in earnest, the result was a defeat for the coalition. This victory was not just a battlefield success. It was a demonstration of operational art at a level rarely seen in the medieval world. Subutai had effectively conducted a long-range campaign across multiple regions, defeating successive forces while maintaining cohesion and effectiveness. He gathered intelligence, tested responses, and returned with knowledge that would later inform even larger invasions into Eastern Europe. What makes Subutai's role in all of this so significant is not simply his skill as a commander, but his ability to function within and help perfect a system of warfare that transformed the Mongol Empire into a force of unprecedented reach. He was not acting alone, and he was not improvising in isolation. He was part of a structure that valued adaptability, merit, and relentless execution. Yet within that structure, his contributions stand out for their scale, consistency, and impact. By the time he returned east, Subutai was no longer just a loyal follower who had pledged himself in metaphor and oath. He had become one of the principal architects of Mongol expansion, a commander whose campaigns would shape the course of history across continents. They spread terror as deliberately as any weapon, and in doing so, they reshaped the psychology of entire regions before a single battle was fought. Muhammad II, already struggling to coordinate a vast and internally fragile empire, found himself confronting an enemy that did not behave according to any familiar strategic logic. Cities fell faster than messages could travel. Armies disappeared without warning. Reports of massacres, some exaggerated, some all too real, arrived faster than clarity. Under that pressure, Muhammad II broke. Instead of consolidating his forces, he abandoned them. Instead of defending his core territories, he fled west. This decision, catastrophic in its consequences, handed Genghis Khan the opportunity he needed. Rather than diverting large forces to hunt a fleeing ruler, he assigned the task to two of his most capable commanders, Subutai and Jib. With a force of roughly 20,000 to 30,000 men, they were ordered to pursue the Shah without limitation, geographically or temporally. It was an instruction that reflected both trust and intent. This was not merely pursuit. It was one of annihilation and discovery. What followed has few parallels in pre-modern warfare. Subutai and Jib drove their forces across Persia, through Azerbaijan, and into the Caucasus Mountains, maintaining relentless pressure on a fleeing enemy who could never quite escape their reach. Though was reduced from emperor to fugitive, stripped of authority, resources, and dignity. Eventually, he died in isolation on an island in the Caspian Sea around 1220, a ruler whose empire had dissolved faster than he could comprehend. But for Subutai and Gebe, the mission did not end with his death. In many ways, it had only just begun. Operating now thousands of miles from the Mongol heartland, without conventional supply lines or reinforcement, they transitioned seamlessly from pursuit to reconnaissance. This was warfare functioning as intelligence gathering on a continental scale. They entered Georgia and defeated it, a force hardened by decades of conflict with neighboring powers and crusading states. They pushed deeper into the Caucasus, encountering the Alans and the Cumans, two groups who initially united against them. Subutai demonstrated one of his most defining traits, the use of diplomacy as a weapon. He sent emissaries to the Cumans, invoking shared pay identity and suggesting that their true enemy was the Alans. The Cumans withdrew from the alliance. Subutai immediately turned his full force against the isolated Alans and destroyed them. Then, without hesitation, he pivoted and attacked the Cumans, defeating them in turn. It was not treachery in the conventional sense. It was method. He was systematically reducing a coalition into manageable parts, ensuring that he never had to fight a unified enemy. The defeated Cumans fled north, carrying with them stories of an enemy unlike any they had encountered. They appealed to the princes of the Rus, a loose confederation of rival rulers whose fragmentation had long prevented unified action. Faced with an external threat of unknown scale, they did something rare. They cooperated. Unfortunately, that cooperation would lead them into one of the most devastating defeats in their history. The confrontation came at the Battle of the Khalkha River. The Mongol force, still numbering perhaps around 20,000, faced a larger coalition of Rus and Cuman troops. On paper, the engagement was not hopeless for the defenders. In practice, it was a disaster waiting to unfold. Subutai initiated a feigned retreat, one of the most sophisticated and dangerous maneuvers in steppe warfare. But this was no brief deception. It lasted 9 days. For 9 days, the Mongols appeared to flee, drawing their enemies deeper into unfamiliar territory. The pursuing forces became stretched, disorganized, and exhausted. Supply lines thinned. Coordination broke down. Confidence, however, grew. It is one of the enduring patterns of military history that success in pursuit often blinds commanders to risk. Subutai understood this. He cultivated it. When the Mongols finally turned to fight, the conditions were exactly as they had engineered them. The Rus forces were fragmented. Theirs was divided. Their troops were fatigued. The Mongols, by contrast, were cohesive, rested through rotation, and operating on ground of their choosing. The result was annihilation. Several princes were killed in battle. Others were captured and executed in a manner reserved for nobility, crushed beneath wooden boards, a method that avoided the spilling of blood while still asserting dominance. And then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the Mongols withdrew. This is what makes this so extraordinary. Subutai had not come to conquer the Rus lands. Not yet. His mission had been reconnaissance in force, to test them, to map the terrain, to understand the political fractures, and to measure the capabilities of them. He had achieved all of this with devastating clarity. The psychological impact alone was immense. The memory of Khalkha would linger, shaping decisions long after the Mongols had vanished from the horizon. When Subutai returned east and reported to Genghis Khan, he brought with him more than victory. He brought knowledge, actionable, detailed, and hard-won. He had effectively scouted an entire theater of future operations. In 1227, Genghis Khan died under circumstances that remain uncertain. Some accounts suggest injuries from a fall during a hunt. Others point to illness, possibly compounded by earlier wounds sustained during campaigns such as those against the Western Shia. What is clear is not how he died, but what followed. The empire he had built did not fracture. At the Kurultai of 1229, his third son, Ojide Khan, was confirmed as Great Khan, in accordance with his father's wishes. that of power, remarkably stable for a polity of such scale and diversity, ensured continuity. The campaigns would continue. The system would endure. For Subutai, however, this moment marked the end of something more personal. He had served Genghis Khan for over 3 decades. From a young warrior pledging absolute loyalty to a rising Pei leader, he had become one of the most formidable commanders in history. The relationship between the two men had defined his life, shaped his career, and given him the framework within which he operated. But Subutai was not finished. If anything, the most ambitious phase of his career was still ahead. Under Ojibway's rule, the knowledge he had gathered in the would be put to use. The reconnaissance would become invasion, and the man who had once chased a broken to the edge of the known world would soon return, not as a scout, but as the architect of one of the largest military campaigns ever undertaken. He had ridden with him, fought for him, and been trusted by him in ways that few others ever were. The emotional reality of losing Genghis Khan is something the sources leave almost entirely unspoken. There are no recorded laments from Subutai, no reflections preserved in chronicles. But absence of evidence is not absence of feeling. A man who had given more than 30 years of absolute loyalty to a single leader does not simply pass over that loss unchanged. What we can say with certainty is that, whatever he felt, he did what he had always done. He adapted. Under Ojibway Khan, Subutai remained the central mind of the empire. Ojibway, often described as less driven by conquest than his father, nevertheless understood the value of the commanders he had inherited. He trusted Subutai, empowered him, and, most importantly, allowed him the operational freedom necessary to plan campaigns on a continental scale. This continuity of command is one of the reasons the Mongol war machine did not falter after 1227. It evolved. The years that followed were anything but idle. Subutai contributed to the phases of campaigns that had begun under Genghis Khan, including the destruction of the Jin dynasty, which finally fell in 1234 after more than 2 decades of sustained pressure. He was also involved in operations affecting the Korean peninsula and the consolidation of Mongol control across northern China. These were not isolated wars. They were components of a continuous imperial strategy that demanded persistence across generations. And yet, even as these eastern campaigns concluded, the West remained unfinished business. The reconnaissance conducted years earlier, culminating in the Battle of the Caucasus River, had revealed both opportunity and vulnerability. Subutai had seen the political fragmentation of the Rus principalities, the limitations of their armies, and the geographic realities of the lands beyond the Volga. The question was not whether to return, but when. Before that return, however, it is necessary to understand something often overshadowed by the drama of conquest: logistics. What Subutai achieved was not simply a series of victories. It was the sustained execution of campaigns across distances that defied the assumptions of medieval warfare. The earlier expedition with Jeeb had covered roughly 8,000 kilometers over 3 years, and comparable to traveling from Western Europe to East Asia. This was not a raid in the conventional sense. It was a mobile system operating continuously across environments, climates, and territories. The later Western campaigns of the 1230s and 1240s would push this even further. Armies of tens of thousands moved across the frozen Russian steppe in winter, crossed the Carpathian Mountains in spring, and descended into the Hungarian plain in summer. This required more than courage or tactical brilliance. It required an intimate understanding of ecology. Horses needed grazing land. Water sources had to be anticipated. Seasonal timing was not incidental, it was fundamental. Subutai's approach to intelligence gathering was equally systematic. Long before armies advanced, Mongol agents, posing as merchants, envoys, or travelers, moved through target regions. They mapped roads, identified river crossings, studied fortifications, and, perhaps most importantly, assessed political divisions. By the time Subutai committed forces to a campaign, he already possessed a layered understanding of the battlefield. Physical maps may have existed, but more critical were the mental maps constructed from accumulated reports. His planning extended beyond immediate engagements. Where many medieval commanders thought in terms of a single campaign season and a decisive battle, Subutai operated across years. He planned multiple columns advancing along separate routes, each capable of independent action but coordinated toward a shared objective. He anticipated failure points, blocked passes, unexpected resistance, supply shortages, and designed alternatives in advance. The actual documents of this planning have not survived, but they are visible in the precision of the campaigns themselves. Understanding Subutai also requires examining those who opposed him. Muhammad II is perhaps the clearest example of strategic failure under pressure. He commanded vast resources, a large army, fortified cities, and a wealthy empire. His decision to disperse his forces across those cities was not irrational. Against a slower, more predictable enemy, it might have forced a prolonged war of attrition. But against the Mongols, it proved disastrous. Subutai and Genghis Khan did not fight on the enemy's terms. They attacked in multiple columns simultaneously, moving faster than communication could keep pace. Each column was strong enough to defeat local resistance. The Shah's of forces, intended as a defensive network, became a liability. His armies could not concentrate quickly enough to respond. By the time he recognized the scale of his authority had already begun to collapse. His flight marked the end of organized resistance. The failure of the Rus princes was different, but equally instructive. They were not paralyzed by overextension. They were undone by disunity and misjudgment. Their decision to pursue a retreating enemy without coordination, without reconnaissance, and without a unified command structure played directly into Subutai's strategy. At the Caucasus River, they encountered not a fleeing force, but a prepared one. In both cases, the pattern is the same. Subutai did not rely on his enemies making mistakes, but when they did, he ensured those mistakes became fatal. It was not a single catastrophic mistake that doomed the Rus princes, but a structural limitation embedded in the very fabric of Kievan Rus. These were rival principalities, bound by culture and faith, but divided by politics and self-interest. No individual ruler, not even a capable one like Mstislav the Bold, could easily overcome that fragmentation. Each prince's concern was his neighbor, not a distant and poorly understood threat emerging from a steppe. Their failure to unite effectively was not incompetence. It was systemic. At the Battle of the Caucasus River, that system met something it had no framework to interpret. The Mongol feigned retreat was not just a clever maneuver, it was a revelation. For 9 days, Subutai maintained the illusion of collapse while preserving perfect cohesion. To the Rus, this was impossible. In their experience, a retreating army was a defeated one. Pursuit was not a risk, it was an opportunity. Subutai turned that assumption into a weapon. When he reversed direction, the princes found themselves facing not a broken force, but a prepared and coordinated one. The result was destruction, not because they were foolish, but because they were operating within a different military reality. A similar pattern unfolded in Central Europe nearly 2 decades later. Henry II the Pious, who confronted the Mongols at the Battle of Legnica, has often been reduced to a tragic footnote. That does him a disservice. He commanded a credible force of knights and infantry, grounded in a tradition of heavy cavalry warfare that had dominated European battlefields for generations. His decision to engage was not reckless. It was consistent with every successful precedent available to him. But those precedents no longer applied. The Mongols refused to fight on his terms. Their horse archers stayed at distance, bleeding the charging knights with relentless volleys. Momentum, so critical to a cavalry charge, collapsed under sustained missile fire. When the formation broke, the Mongols encircled and destroyed what remained. Henry's courage was unquestionable. His defeat was not a failure of will, but of encountering an enemy who had rewritten the rules of engagement. Perhaps the most tragic figure among Subutai's opponents was Bela IV of Hungary. Unlike many others, he understood the magnitude of the Mongol threat. He prepared extensively, assembling a large army and even accepting the Cumans, nomadic refugees fleeing Mongol expansion, into his kingdom. It was a controversial but strategically sound decision, intended to strengthen his cavalry forces. Yet internal politics undermined him. The murder of the Cuman leader triggered their mass departure at a critical moment, depriving Beilao of valuable allies. When the Mongols finally engaged his forces at the Battle of Mohi, the outcome hinged not on ignorance, but on a failure to anticipate the full of Mongol capability. Subutai coordinated an attack, executed complex river crossings, and constructed an encirclement under cover of darkness, an operation so sophisticated that European armies had no precedent for detecting or countering it in time. Beilaz was not unprepared in the conventional sense. It was simply unprepared for this kind of war. The Mongols combined mobility, maneuver, capability, and psychological pressure into a single of warfare that overwhelmed traditional. By the time lessons could have been learned, the army that needed them no longer existed. This pattern repeated across every theater in which Subutai operated. His opponents were often capable, experienced, and brave. They were not incompetent, but they were playing within a framework that assumed certain constants about movement, communication, and battle that the Mongols had already transcended. The gap was not one of skill alone. It was conceptual. Subutai was not merely a better commander within the same paradigm. He was operating within a fundamentally different one. When the Great Western Campaign began in 1236 under Batu Khan, this new system reached its fullest expression. Batu was the leader, the prince whose lineage gave legitimacy to the. But the structure, and the execution all bore the unmistakable imprint of Subutai. He was the architect behind the advance. The first objective, the Volga Bulgaria, fell quickly. The Cumans were scattered, their resistance broken. By 1237, the Mongol armies turned once more toward the lands of the Rus, territory Subutai had already studied years earlier. He was not entering unknown ground. He was returning to a mapped and understood battle space. And then came one of his most striking decisions. The campaign would proceed in winter. To contemporaries, this seemed incomprehensible. Winter was traditionally a season of when armies halted operations due to cold, lack of forage, and impossible terrain. Subutai saw something different. Frozen rivers became roads. Marshes hardened into passable ground. The very conditions that immobilized other armies became advantages for one that understood how to exploit them. It was not just bold. It was systematic, and it ensured that, once again, his enemies would be fighting a war they did not yet understand. The rivers of Kievan Rus, which in spring and autumn normally acted as major natural barriers, became frozen highways during winter. Mongol horses could move across solid ice. Supply wagons advanced along routes where boats and ferries would usually be required. At the same time, Russian cities, dependent on stored agricultural surplus, were least prepared to endure prolonged sieges during the cold season. Princes who might have coordinated a joint defense in warmer months were instead forced into reaction under extreme time pressure. Ryazan fell first. Its ruler appealed to neighboring princes for aid and received none, a pattern of fragmentation that would repeat itself with devastating consequences. The city was captured and destroyed in December 1237. Vladimir followed in February 1238. One by one, cities collapsed as Mongol columns swept across the landscape with extraordinary speed, spreading like coordinated waves of destruction. This was not only Mongol military superiority. It was also the structural weakness of the defending system. The Rus principalities were political rivals first and allies second. Their princes prioritized local survival over collective defense. Subutai's intelligence networks had identified this fragmentation long before the invasion began. The entire operational tempo of the campaign was designed to prevent coordination from ever fully forming. Novgorod escaped destruction not through diplomacy or resistance, but through geography and timing. The spring thaw turned surrounding terrain into impassable marshland before Mongol forces could reach it. Subutai, recognizing the risk to mobility and supply, chose not to press forward. Some historians argue this moment preserved the city's future significance. Others suggest it was only a temporary reprieve within a larger planned advance. The pause was brief. By 1240, the campaign resumed. Kiev, the most symbolically important center of the Rus world, was besieged and destroyed. A Franciscan friar, Giovanni Appian del Carpine, later described fields of skulls stretching across the landscape. Even allowing for medieval exaggeration, the account reflects destruction on an immense scale. By the winter of 1240 to 1241, Subutai was ready for the next phase, the invasion of Europe. What he designed was not a single campaign, but a coordinated multi-front operation spanning hundreds of miles. Communication between columns was limited, relying on prearranged timing and absolute discipline. The margin for error was minimal. One force, led by Batu Khan and Subutai himself, would advance through the Carpathian passes into Hungary. Another northern column moved into Poland under commanders such as Baidar and Ordokan. Its purpose was not conquest but containment, to neutralize Polish forces and prevent any northern coalition from forming during the Hungarian advance. The Polish campaign began in early 1241. Mongol forces struck at multiple points, defeating regional armies and capturing key positions. At the Battle of Legnica on April 9th, they faced a combined European force that included Polish knights and Teutonic elements under Henry II the Pious. Henry's army was experienced and well-equipped in the traditions of European heavy cavalry warfare. It was a credible force by any medieval standard. But the Mongols did not engage it on those terms. Instead, they used missile fire, feigned withdrawals, and controlled encirclement to dismantle the charge-based doctrine that European knights relied upon. The decisive moment came when the cavalry charge was pulled out of formation, losing cohesion and becoming vulnerable to repeated strikes. The result was total collapse. The flanks were enveloped, and the battle quickly turned into a massacre. Henry II the Pious was killed in the chaos. According to chroniclers, his head was placed on a spear and displayed as a warning near the aftermath of the battle, a grim signal meant to communicate total defeat. The surviving Polish forces disintegrated under pressure, and soon after, the northern Mongol column turned southward. Just 2 days later, an astonishingly short interval given the distances involved, the main engagement in Hungary reached its climax. The coordination between these two operations, separated by hundreds of miles and conducted without any form of rapid communication, reflects an extraordinary level of planning. The timing was not accidental. It was the result of carefully synchronized operational design. Bela IV of Hungary was not a naive ruler. He had been warned repeatedly about the approaching threat. Reports from fleeing Cumans had already described the nature of Mongol warfare. In response, he assembled a large army and fortified a position near the Sajo River at Mohi. His defensive arrangements seemed sound. A river barrier on one side and a wagon fort constructed as a defensive perimeter on the other, consistent with European military practice of the time. His forces likely numbered between 40,000 and 60,000 men, though exact figures remain debated. Subutai, however, possessed something more decisive than numbers: intelligence. Mongol scouts had carefully mapped the Hungarian position, identifying the single main bridge over the Sajo River that would be critical to any crossing. They studied terrain, river conditions, and the layout of the wagon fort. From this, Subutai derived a plan that turned the Hungarian defensive confidence into a structural weakness. On the night of April 10th to 11th, 1241, the Mongol forces executed a divided operation. A detachment under Batu Khan launched a direct assault on the bridge, capturing it in darkness and forcing the Hungarian guards back. This attack triggered the expected response. Hungarian troops rushed to reinforce the crossing point, concentrating their strength exactly where Subutai had anticipated. Meanwhile, Subutai led a larger force on a wide flanking maneuver, crossing the Sajo at a downstream ford. While the Hungarian army remained fixated on the bridge, his column moved into position behind their lines. By dawn, the encirclement was nearly complete. Hungarian forces were effectively surrounded on 3 sides, with the river limiting retreat. The battle that followed was systematic rather than chaotic. Mongol artillery and fire-based weapons struck the wagon fort from multiple directions. What had been designed as a defensive perimeter became a containment structure. Attempts to break out were met by prepared Mongol units positioned precisely for interception. One of the most revealing elements of the engagement was the deliberate creation of an apparent escape route. The Mongols left a gap in their encirclement, which the Hungarian forces interpreted as a chance for survival. In reality, it functioned as a controlled channel of withdrawal. As the Hungarians retreated through it, their cohesion collapsed. They were then pursued and destroyed in fragmented groups across the surrounding terrain. Bela IV of Hungary narrowly escaped, eventually fleeing and living as a refugee before gradually rebuilding his authority. But the Hungarian military structure was shattered. High-ranking clergy, including bishops and archbishops, were killed. Much of the nobility was wiped out, leaving the kingdom politically and socially destabilized. Following the battle, Mongol forces advanced deep into Central Europe, raiding as far as the Adriatic. Panic spread across Europe. Courts in Vienna, the Holy Roman Empire, and beyond began exchanging urgent warnings. Pope Gregory IX called for a crusade, while Frederick II, Holy Roman Emperor, issued urgent correspondence in response to the growing crisis. What had once seemed a distant steppe threat now appeared, for the first time, as something that could reach the heart of Europe. The mechanisms of European collective defense, such as they were, began to move only slowly toward coordination. By the time this reaction started forming, Subutai had already pushed the campaign to its furthest operational point. Contemporary sources suggest that further advances into Germany, and possibly even toward France, were within Mongol strategic consideration. Whether this was a fully developed plan or an extension of momentum remains debated. But what is clear is that the Mongol military system had not yet reached an internal stopping point. Then the entire structure shifted. The death of Genghis Khan in December 1241 triggered the established Mongol requirement that all senior princes and commanders return to the heartland for a Kurultai of succession. For Batu Khan, as a senior Chinggisid prince, attendance was mandatory. The Western advance therefore halted, not because of military resistance, but because of political structure. Europe, which had braced itself for further invasion, instead witnessed something it could not interpret: the sudden withdrawal of an apparently unstoppable force. In many European chronicles, this retreat was attributed to divine intervention, prayer, or moral victory. The actual cause, a dynastic death occurring thousands of miles away, remained unknown to contemporaries and was only reconstructed much later through Mongol sources. The counterfactual question inevitably follows: what if the advance had continued? Subutai's logistical system was operating at extreme limits but still functioning. Western Europe presented a different strategic environment from the Hungarian plain: denser population centers, more fortified towns, and more fragmented but potentially adaptable military responses. Forested terrain and reduced open steppe would have limited the effectiveness of pure cavalry maneuver. Yet the pattern up to that point suggested that adaptation against Mongol operations was slow, often slower than Mongol movement itself. Whether Germany or France could have coordinated an effective response in time remains unknowable. What is clear is that the Mongol system depended on tempo, and the interruption of that tempo ended the campaign before such tests could occur. After the Kurultai, internal Mongol politics absorbed much of the empire's attention. Western momentum dissipated. The invasion force did not return in its previous form. Subutai, now in his late 60s, returned east after a lifetime spent on continuous campaign. By any standard of the era, his career was extraordinary. Wars across Mongolia, northern China, Central Asia, the Caucasus, Russia, and Hungary. Few commanders in history operated across such a range of environments with sustained success. Yet it would be misleading to imagine him as a solitary genius acting alone. The Mongol command structure was collaborative, though tightly disciplined. Understanding his partners helped clarify how the system functioned. Jib, whose name means arrow, was among Subutai's earliest and most important operational partners. During the Great Western Reconnaissance, the two functioned as a dual command, operating far beyond direct imperial supervision. Jib was impulsive, fast-moving, and aggressively opportunistic. Subutai was deliberate, analytical, and methodical. Together, they formed a balance between speed and planning that made their campaigns unusually effective. Jib's death, recorded ambiguously in the sources, removed that equilibrium, and Subutai did not later find another partner with the same level of operational symmetry. Batu Khan added a different dimension to this structure. As the nominal commander of the Western campaign, Batu provided the political legitimacy required by Mongol imperial hierarchy. Subutai provided the operational design. This separation of authority was not ideal from a purely military standpoint, but it was essential for maintaining cohesion within a system where lineage determined rank. Tension between political authority and operational expertise was constant. Batu's position depended on bloodline. Subutai's influence depended on effectiveness. Everyone involved understood this imbalance. Yet Subutai's skill lay not in challenging it, but in working through it. He ensured that strategic plans could be executed without undermining princely authority, effectively translating political command into military precision. At times, disagreements surfaced. In one recorded episode, Batu favored the immediate destruction of a resisting city, while Subutai argued for restraint, not out of leniency, but calculation. The city's location made it valuable for logistics and supply control. The disagreement reflects a recurring dynamic: Batu's emphasis on punishment and dominance, and Subutai's focus on longer-term operational utility. Neither perspective fully dominated every decision. The Western campaign succeeded not because one vision prevailed absolutely, but because Subutai was able to integrate both political imperatives and strategic logic into a functioning system. By the time he returned east, Subutai had become something rare in military history. Not just a commander of battles, but an architect of campaigns across continents, operating within, and often subtly shaping, the political constraints of an empire that stretched farther than any before it. His relationship with the princes he served reveals something fundamental about how power functioned within the Mongol Empire. Subutai was never fully autonomous. He operated inside a hierarchy of imperial authority that he could influence, shape, and at times quietly steer, but never replace. His brilliance lay not in escaping those constraints, but in working inside them with extraordinary efficiency, producing results that transformed entire regions while still respecting the formal dominance of royal bloodlines over merit. When viewed from this angle, his Western withdrawal takes on a different meaning. It was not simply a military pause. It determined the fate of millions who remained behind. In the aftermath of the Mongol advance into Central Europe, the cities of Hungary endured months of disruption and occupation during 1241 to 1242. Contemporary accounts describe a landscape reshaped by war. Settlements burned or abandoned, roads filled with displaced survivors, and agricultural systems disrupted across wide regions. Bela IV of Hungary, forced into retreat, survived in exile while sending urgent appeals for assistance that his fragmented political system could not immediately answer. The psychological impact on the population was profound. Later Hungarian chronicles describe communities struggling to interpret the scale and speed of destruction. A Franciscan friar, Ogiek of Hungary, wrote Carmen Miserabile, Song of Lamentation, describing devastated villages, abandoned fields, and remains of the dead left unburied in the aftermath of collapse. Even allowing for literary exaggeration, the underlying reality it reflects is one of severe demographic and social disruption. When the Mongols eventually withdrew in 1242, they left behind more than physical damage. They altered Europe's perception of security itself. The assumption, deeply embedded in medieval European thought, that fortified Christian kingdoms could not be penetrated with overwhelming speed and coordination was fundamentally shaken. Military traditions that had been shaped by crusading warfare and heavy cavalry doctrines suddenly appeared incomplete. At battles such as Battle of Legnica and Battle of Mohi, conventional expectations about cavalry shock, fortified camps, and battlefield momentum had failed to produce predictable outcomes. Some rulers began reassessing fortifications, logistics, and mobility. Others attributed survival to providence and returned to older assumptions once immediate danger passed. The key point is that adaptation was uneven. Europe did not immediately transform its military systems in response to Mongol warfare. Instead, it absorbed the shock partially, unevenly, and over generations. Subutai, meanwhile, understood exactly what he had revealed. His campaigns had effectively mapped the structural weaknesses of European political and military organization. Whether or not a renewed invasion would have succeeded, he had already demonstrated that traditional European battlefield logic could be bypassed through speed, coordination, and operational depth. Even in his later years, Subutai remained active in Mongol imperial expansion. He participated in continued operations against the Song dynasty in southern China, a theater that posed entirely different challenges from the steppe and European plains. The Song possessed strong river networks, fortified urban centers, and naval capabilities that limited pure cavalry dominance. In response, Mongol forces under Subutai's strategic influence increasingly adopted hybrid methods, combining siege engineering, infantry support, and coordinated riverine operations with traditional cavalry mobility. This adaptability reflected a broader Mongol trait, but Subutai's role was to recognize constraints early and integrate new tools without ideological resistance. The conquest of southern China would not be completed until decades later under Kublai Khan, culminating in 1279. By that time, Subutai was already long dead, having passed away around 1248. His death is recorded without detail in surviving sources, a quiet disappearance from the historical record after a life spent almost entirely in motion. For historians, evaluating Subutai presents a persistent challenge. He is credited in traditional accounts with participation in dozens of major engagements across Eurasia, often described as undefeated in field command. Even when these figures are treated cautiously, the scale of his operational impact remains exceptional. Campaigns attributed to his planning reshaped political boundaries across Central Asia, the Middle East, and Eastern Europe. The evidence from independently documented encounters, such as Battle of Khalkha River, Battle of Legnica, and Battle of Mohi, confirms a consistent pattern: the ability to coordinate mobility, intelligence, and psychological pressure at a scale rarely matched in pre-modern warfare. Later military theorists, including 19th-century thinkers such as Karl von Clausewitz, would define military genius in terms that align closely with Subutai's operational style: the capacity to navigate uncertainty, integrate complex variables, and make decisions whose consequences remain valid beyond the immediate battlefield. In that sense, Subutai is less a figure of legend than a rare historical example of sustained strategic execution across an entire continent. Subutai consistently demonstrated these qualities across more than 6 decades of campaigning. In the 20th century, military theorist B.H. Littlehart became one of the most influential Western writers to engage seriously with Subutai's reputation. He argued that Subutai's emphasis on maneuver, deception, and indirect approach anticipated principles that modern doctrine would only later formalize. Writing in the aftermath of the First World War, Littlehart was reacting to the devastation of frontal warfare and trench attrition, and in doing so he may have idealized historical examples like Subutai more than is strictly warranted. Even so, his central insight remains significant. The campaigns of the 1220s and 1240s reveal a commander operating with an intuitive grasp of operational principles that European and Chinese military establishments had not yet clearly articulated in theoretical form. At the same time, Subutai must not be abstracted into a purely technical model of perfect strategy. His achievements were inseparable from the world in which they were executed. The same campaigns that demonstrate extraordinary operational intelligence were also accompanied by immense destruction. Cities across Central Asia, such as Samarkand, Bukhara, and Merv, were sacked, their populations killed or dispersed, and their cultural infrastructure devastated. In regions such as Persia and Mesopotamia, long-developed irrigation systems that had supported dense agricultural societies were damaged or abandoned, contributing to long-term economic and demographic disruption. The scale of loss has been debated extensively by historians. Some high-end estimates attribute tens of millions of deaths to the wider Mongol conquests, while more conservative figures remain nonetheless extremely large in global historical context. It is important to distinguish between intent and implementation. There is little evidence that Subutai independently designed the broader policy of terror associated with Mongol expansion. That approach is generally attributed to the strategic framework established by Genghis Khan. However, Subutai operated fully within that system and executed its campaigns with exceptional effectiveness. His brilliance as an operational commander cannot be separated from the imperial structure he served. This tension, between admiration for strategic genius and acknowledgement of the human cost, is central to any serious evaluation of Subutai. It cannot be resolved through simplification. It defines his historical reality. If one surveys the canon of widely recognized military commanders, the same figures tend to recur. Alexander, Caesar, Hannibal, Napoleon, and others rooted in Greco-Roman and European traditions. Subutai is far less frequently included, not because his record is weaker, but because historical memory is culturally structured. Part of this is documentary tradition. Figures like Julius Caesar and Alexander the Great left written accounts or were chronicled by contemporaries whose works became foundational texts in later education systems. Their narratives were preserved, studied, and continuously retold within the intellectual lineage of Europe. Subutai, by contrast, left no known personal writings. He likely did not operate within a literate bureaucratic culture in his early formation. The primary sources describing his campaigns come from Persian chroniclers, Chinese imperial historians, and Mongol-era compilers who typically emphasize Khans and dynastic authority over individual field commanders. As a result, his role is often present in the record, but not centered within it. There is also a question of cultural familiarity. Western historiography has traditionally found it easier to integrate figures whose cultural and religious contexts align, broadly, with Greco-Roman or Abrahamic frameworks. The Mongol world, shamanistic, syncretic, and pragmatically adaptive, resists easy categorization within those narratives. Even their political structures and mobility-based society differ sharply from settled imperial models. And finally, there is the moral dimension. It is often easier, within popular historical memory, to admire commanders associated primarily with battlefield victories than those whose campaigns also involved large-scale destruction of cities and civilian populations. Napoleon Bonaparte, for example, is frequently evaluated through a lens that emphasizes battlefield maneuver while minimizing the scale of civilian devastation in some of his campaigns. Subutai's record does not allow for that separation as easily. None of this justifies his marginalization in serious historical discussion. On the contrary, it makes his inclusion more necessary. Understanding Subutai is not about moral endorsement. It is about analytical clarity. His campaigns illuminate how mobility, intelligence, coordination, and psychological pressure can reshape entire geopolitical systems. The Mongol Empire at its height, stretching from Korea to Eastern Europe, represented the largest contiguous land empire in history. Its period of consolidation, often referred to as the Pax Mongolica, enabled unprecedented movement across Eurasia. Trade routes expanded, long-distance communication increased, and figures such as Marco Polo traveled along networks made safer and more connected under Mongol authority. Yet this same connectivity also facilitated the spread of catastrophic events, including the movement of disease such as the Black Death. The infrastructure that enabled exchange also enabled transmission at a continental scale. Subutai's legacy, therefore, is not confined to military history alone. The operational systems he helped refine, mobility, intelligence networks, multi-front coordination, became part of a broader imperial structure that influenced Eurasian development long after his death. Subutai's methods contain elements that later became central to modern operational warfare: deep reconnaissance, coordinated multicolumn movement, long-range logistical planning, and the systematic integration of intelligence into decision-making. These features reappear in later military thought, sometimes directly influenced by study of Mongol campaigns, and sometimes emerging independently as other commanders confronted similar strategic problems on different continents. The 20th century military historian B.H. Vidalhat drew explicit parallels between Mongol operational methods and what he called the indirect approach. His argument was not simply admiration, but an attempt to explain why modern mechanized warfare seemed to rediscover principles that Subutai's armies had already practiced centuries earlier. Even if one treats such comparisons cautiously, the structural similarities are difficult to ignore. Speed, dispersion, deception, and the coordination of separated forces toward a single strategic outcome. At the same time, the regions that experienced the full force of Mongol expansion were altered in ways that extended far beyond the battlefield. In parts of Persia, agricultural systems that had taken centuries to develop were disrupted or destroyed, and some regions struggled to restore pre-invasion levels of productivity for generations. In parts of Rus', political fragmentation deepened under the pressures of conquest and tributary systems, contributing to long-term shifts in governance, trade orientation, and regional development. One of the most consequential downstream events of the broader Mongol expansion was the destruction of the Abbasid political center in Baghdad in 1258 by Mongol forces acting under the wider imperial system that Subutai had helped strengthen. The fall of the Abbasid Caliphate, an institution that had shaped Islamic intellectual and political life for centuries, marked a major turning point in Middle Eastern history. Although Subutai was not directly responsible for that specific campaign, it occurred within the imperial structure whose effectiveness his earlier work helped establish. It is therefore more accurate to describe Subutai not as the sole cause of these transformations, but as one of the most effective instruments of a larger imperial machine, an empire with its own internal logic, momentum, and expansionary pressures that exceeded any single commander's intent. Still, within that system, his influence on operational outcomes was decisive. The direction of campaigns often followed the strategic paths he was capable of executing. Subutai died in 1248, likely in the Mongol heartland. By that time, he had spent more than half a century in continuous military service. Born the son of a blacksmith, he rose to become one of the most capable field commanders in history, transforming the organization of warfare across Eurasia through a combination of discipline, adaptability, and relentless operational execution. Yet his legacy occupies an unusual place in historical memory. Unlike figures such as Julius Caesar or Napoleon Bonaparte, whose lives were recorded in autobiographical writings or extensive contemporary narrative traditions, Subutai left no personal written record. His world was preserved through external lenses, Persian chroniclers documenting invasions, Chinese historians recording dynastic pressures, and Mongol-era compilations that often prioritize Khans over field commanders. As a result, his presence in popular historical consciousness is limited not by insignificance, but by the structure of historical transmission itself. He is less visible because the narrative channels that shape global memory were not designed around his culture, language, or mode of leadership. There is also the question of cultural distance. The Mongol world, rooted in steppe mobility, oral transmission, and pragmatic religious syncretism, does not align neatly with the civilizational frameworks through which much Western historiography has traditionally been constructed. This distance has contributed to Subutai's relative absence from mainstream historical narratives, despite the scale of his impact. And finally, there is the moral complexity of his campaigns. Subutai's operational brilliance cannot be separated from the destructive consequences of the wars he helped conduct. Cities across Central Asia, including major centers such as Samarkand, Bukhara, and Maiv, experienced devastation and mass displacement during the Mongol expansion. The scale of suffering complicates any attempt to treat his record as purely technical or celebratory. This tension is unavoidable. It is what separates historical analysis from mythology. Subutai cannot be reduced either to a heroic strategist or to a simple symbol of destruction. He exists in the intersection of both, extraordinary operational capability embedded within a system that produced vast human cost. Modern estimates of the wider Mongol conquest's demographic impact vary widely, but even conservative interpretations acknowledge profound disruption across Eurasia. Some historians suggest that cumulative mortality and indirect consequences may have reached into the tens of millions, though precise figures remain uncertain and debated. What is not in dispute is the scale of transformation across political and ecological systems. Within that transformation, Subutai's role was that of an executor of strategy rather than its sole originator. The broader doctrine of terror and submission is generally associated with Genghis Khan and the evolving imperial system he established. Subutai's contribution lay in making that system operationally effective at unprecedented scale. This duality, technical brilliance paired with participation in large-scale violence, is what gives his story its enduring analytical weight. It forces a refusal of simple categorization. He was not a symbolic hero, nor a one-dimensional destroyer. He was a highly capable military mind working at the center of one of history's most effective expansion systems. In that sense, Subutai's legacy is less about personal glory than about structural understanding. His campaigns demonstrate how intelligence, logistics, coordination, and psychological pressure can be combined into a coherent operational system capable of reshaping continents. The Mongol Empire, at its height, became the largest contiguous land empire in history, linking regions from East Asia to Eastern Europe. The stability that followed in parts of this system, often described as the Pax Mongolica, facilitated long-distance trade and communication across Eurasia. Travelers such as Marco Polo moved along routes made safer and more connected under Mongol control, even as other consequences of expansion continued to reshape societies in more destructive ways. Diseases such as the Black Death also spread along these same networks, illustrating how increased connectivity can produce both integration and catastrophe. Ultimately, Subutai's historical significance lies not in his absence from popular memory, but in what that absence reveals. Historical recognition is not distributed purely by achievement. It is shaped by language, documentation, cultural familiarity, and narrative inheritance. Subutai sits outside many of those channels, even though the scale of his influence rivals or exceeds at a far more widely remembered figures. His career shows that the mechanics of power are rarely about isolated genius. They are about systems, how they are built, how they move, and how individuals operate within them at moments of extreme consequence.